Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 1.
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the UK took on the COP26 presidency on the 31st of October last year at the start of the COP26 conference in Glasgow. We hold the presidency throughout this year until the start of COP27 in November, when we pass the presidency baton to Egypt. We're already working closely with Egypt and other partners to ensure that countries deliver on the commitments they made at COP26.
Peterborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister will use his remaining time as President to pivot the conference away from making climate change the #1 goal, but to make energy security the #1 goal.
Mr. Speaker, he raises an important point. One of the reasons that we have reduced in the UK our dependence on gas is precisely because we pushed out, in terms of renewables, we have the second biggest offshore wind sector in the world, and we want to quadruple it. And clearly, what I want to see as part of this, the solution to tackling climate change is to have a clean energy transition across the world.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. One of the setbacks at COP26 was the failure to reassemble the coalition that we managed to put together in Paris in 2015, which met that high ambition to bring both developed and developing countries together to put pressure on the big emitters and to pull weight. So in the transition to a new presidency, what is the current president doing to try and rebuild that coalition ahead of Egypt taking on the role?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I just gently point out to the honourable gentleman that the Glasgow Climate Pact was actually delivered as a result of consensus brokered by the UK across almost 200 countries. What we now need to ensure is that we get countries to deliver on the commitments that they made, and that is what I am focused on during the rest of my time as COP President.
Gagan Mahindra.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
President.
Mr. Speaker, COP26 was one of the first conferences where there was a significant presence from the private sector, and collectively business made a significant number of commitments. 5,000 international companies have signed up to the UN's Race to Zero campaign, including over half of the FTSE 100.
Gagan Mahindra.
Mr. Speaker, I can thank Mr. President for that answer. My constituent, Wayne Maguire of Grove Innovations in Tring, does excellent work in fitting heat pumps to households, which can be a vital assistance in reducing the use of coal as agreed to in the Glasgow Climate Pact. What provisions have the government made following COP26 to support other businesses like Grove Innovations and ensure that the installation of green technologies is viable for all households?
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend's constituent, Wayne Maguire of Grove Innovations, for the work that he is doing to ensure a green energy transition in our own country. And with regard to support, as announced in our heat and building strategy last year, the government is launching a new £450 million boiler upgrade scheme, providing upfront grants of up to £6,000 to install heat pumps.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Number 3, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, COP26 was the first COP where a section of the cover decisions was devoted to loss and damage. We agreed a new Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage, which will discuss the arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimise and address loss and damage.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The latest IPCC report confirms that many of the consequences of climate change are already locked in, regardless of ongoing efforts to mitigate, and that the consequences will fall mostly on those least able to cope and least responsible for the crisis. So can the President confirm that his government will be aiming for an equitable loss and damage agreement that compensates developing nations and recognises the disproportionate role of developed nations in causing such loss and damage?
President.
Mr. Speaker, I note the point that he's made. He will know that the UK itself already funds internationally relevant activities to loss and damage, including humanitarian and disaster response support. With regard to the Glasgow dialogue, clearly that is going to be a consensus-driven process, and ultimately all the parties are going to have to reach a collective decision on the outcome and the results of that dialogue. But clearly what we want to ensure is progress during this year.
Come to SNP spokesperson Deirdre Brooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The IPCC's latest report, as my honourable friend mentioned, acknowledged loss and damage and warned it's most concentrated among the poorest, most vulnerable populations. The loss and damage mechanism, though, was established at COP19 back in 2013, recognised in Paris in 2015, but its details are, however, still to be finalised. The Scottish Government stepped up to the plate in Glasgow on this issue, followed by private enterprises and others such as Wallonia. It's clearly going to be the subject of even more international attention at COP27. As COP President, what pressure is he putting on his own government to follow the Scottish Government's lead?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said in response to an earlier question, the UK is already funding activities internationally which are relevant to tackling loss and damage. That is indeed the case, and she knows that we are doubling our international climate finance commitment. My role is to broker consensus amongst almost 200 parties, and that is why we need to make sure that by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh, we have made some progress on the discussion on loss and damage. But I hear what she is saying.
Robin Moore.
4, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 4, 8, 11 and 12 together. As I've already noted, we are working with Egypt as the incoming presidency and other partners to ensure that countries deliver on the commitments they signed up to in the Glasgow Climate Pact, and we want to make sure that there is progress on adaptation, on finance, and of course support for developing nations. And we need to ensure that all countries revisit their 2030 emission reduction targets.
Robin Moore.
Mr. Speaker, at a local level across Keighley and Ilkley, we have experienced the real impacts of climate change, including flooding at Utley, a landslide in Riddlesden, and severe water issues along Redcar Lane and Steeton. So can I ask my honourable friend, as we look to build on the deal achieved at COP26 last year, how will we work with international partners to make real progress on adapting to these damaging effects of climate change?
Mr. Speaker, a number of colleagues have raised the issue of the IPCC report, and my honourable friend, of course, raises a very vitally important point. And the report was indeed a grim reminder to the world about the climate change and how it's affecting our planet. What it does underline, and this is what we are doing through our presidency, is working with parties to ensure there is faster progress on adaptation, particularly on finance, that commitment to double adaptation finance. Domestically, we're putting in place robust measures, including £5.2 billion to tackle coastal erosion and flooding in the UK.
Let's do better.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the great successes of our COP presidency was the amount of private capital dedicated towards net zero. It increased from $5 trillion to a staggering $130 trillion. Wow. How will my right honourable friend keep up this momentum?
Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend highlights, net zero has indeed become one of the clearest financial trends. And I pay tribute to Mark Carney and his whole team for establishing the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, to which he refers, and I hope that during this year additional private capital will sign up to this alliance. And indeed, part of the work of GFANZ is to ensure that some of the funds are directed towards climate resilient projects in developing nations. We are working with GFANZ and other partners towards this objective.
Mr. Speaker, the UK seizes the opportunities of net zero to create new industries and green jobs. How is the President of COP26 prioritising skills to help the United Kingdom and the world achieve our ultimate goal?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is very right to link achieving net zero with jobs creation. And of course, as we build these new green industries, this will require equipping workers with the right skills. And I want to congratulate him for all the hard work that he did in ensuring an award from the UK Government of £380,000 to Borders College in his constituency to develop green courses in entrepreneurship and carbon literacy. And I look forward to visiting the college next week together with him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has committed to getting the Santiago network on loss and damage running to provide concrete solutions. Will he provide a further update on this?
President.
Mr. Speaker, work on the Santiago network is underway. Submissions are being requested from parties, and as she knows, it's a 2-year programme well, what we want to ensure with the Santiago network is that by the end of this year, by COP27, we have operationalised it and ensured there is funding available to provide technical support to countries that need it.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the President for attending the meeting of the Small Island Developing States recently. They really appreciated that. If global warming is kept at 2 degrees, we will lose 99% of our coral reefs. If it's at 1.5 degrees, we'll lose 70%. It seems particularly appropriate with the next, with COP27 being held in Sharm el-Sheikh, that this should be a priority. So could the President tell us whether it will be?
Mr. Speaker, absolutely, it is a priority, and I think she makes a particular reference to support that's being provided for adaptation. As I said, we did get a commitment at COP26 for developed nations to double the amount of money going towards adaptation finance by 2025, and I want to ensure that we are on trajectory by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Reuters reports today that data shows that the corporate world remains far from being aligned with global climate goals, and in some countries have gone backwards since the agreements. What does he have to say to that?
Well, what I would say, Speaker, is that there is a very clear recognition within the private sector that net zero is the right approach. It's obviously what customers and clients want, but it's also good for the bottom line. And my honourable friend made reference to $130 trillion of assets being committed to net zero. We need to ensure, of course, that those commitments are in line with the science, and that, I know, is one of the things that the UN Secretary-General is also looking to do through his expert group.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Glasgow Climate Pact and indeed the COP26 priorities contain a commitment to keep 1.5 alive. Yet the UNEP Production Gap report warns that governments plan to produce more than twice the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than is consistent with 1.5. So real climate leaders don't licence new oil, gas or coal, and no amount of climate checkpoints will change the climate reality. Will his government scrap its checkpoint as inconsistent with climate leadership and rule out new fossil fuel licences once and for all?
Mr. Speaker, we put forward a plan for how we wanted to ensure that our climate compatibility checkpoint was consistent with our legally binding commitment to net zero by 2050. That consultation closed on Monday. I hope she responded to it, and I know the Business Department will come forward with its views on the checkpoint in due course.
Anna Mackmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just over 100 days after world leaders agreed vital efforts to limit global warming at COP26, a UN report has issued a stark warning and dire consequences of inaction. This Conservative government is asleep at the wheel when it comes to delivering a secure and stable future. Will the Minister go further and act faster to cut emissions, commit to adaptation finance and prevent the atlas of human suffering from becoming a grim reality?
Mr. Speaker, I just have to sort of say to her that you have to judge this government on its record. We have cut emissions the fastest of any of the G20 or the G7 in recent years. We've got the second biggest offshore wind sector in the world. We want to quadruple that by 2030. And the reason we are not reliant on Russian gas is precisely because we have focused on clean energy in our country, and that's what we want to see delivered across the rest of the world as well.
Sir Oliver Hill.
My right honourable friend will be aware of the key role of marine conservation in tackling climate change, and he'll be aware that damage to the seabed and also to the plants that are there can be very damaging to the battle against climate change. With that in mind, would he look at the bill presented yesterday by my right honourable friend for Epsom and Ewell, supported by me and others, which would ban bottom trawling, because that would mean that we could really tackle this better?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll be happy to look at the bill that he refers to, of course. But as we know from the IPCC report, that if global warming continues at current rates, by 2030, 2070, we could be in a position where a third of our plant and animal species are extinct.
Secretary Miliband.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this House stands in solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and his COP presidency now faces an utterly changed context with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The crisis shows how global dependence on fossil fuels can support the most tyrannical regimes. This is a war underwritten by Russia's oil and gas. Does he agree with me, therefore, that the best route to protect our energy and national security and undermine the power of Putin is not by increasing our dependence on fossil fuels, whose price is set in the international market, but by supercharging the drive to renewables, nuclear and energy efficiency, so all countries, including our own, have clean, cheap, homegrown power?
Mr. Speaker, no one can be failed to be moved by the appalling suffering of the citizens of Ukraine, including, of course, children, and they are enduring unimaginable conditions, and our hearts and thoughts are very much with them. He makes an important point in terms of a clean energy transition. I've said in the past that what we want to see is a managed clean energy transition. That's why we put forward the North Sea transition deal, and of course this government is focused on renewables, on nuclear, on hydrogen.
Mr. Speaker, an essential part of becoming less dependent on fossil fuels is to reduce our demand for gas by making more progress on energy efficiency. On its own, insulating the 18 million drafty homes in our country would cut our imports of gas by 15%, double the amount we import from Russia. In his role holding government departments to account on net zero, will he now persuade the Treasury and other colleagues that it's the time to finally get serious and invest at scale in the national programme to upgrade Britain's homes that Labour has long been calling for?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman, is right, of course, that buildings are responsible for 20% of emissions in the UK, and we did set out in our heat and building strategy the aim to ensure that we insulate homes, and he's right. That is how you reduce emissions, but also reduce costs for individuals and businesses.
Mark Fletcher. Question number 5, please.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 5, 6, 7, 13 and 15 together. At COP26, almost 200 countries agreed to the historic Glasgow Climate Pact, which keeps alive the aim of limiting average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. At the Munich Security Conference last month, John Kerry, the US Special Envoy for Climate, referred to COP26 as perhaps the best, if not one of the best COPs, saying it did more than Paris. It really gave life to Paris. We now need to ensure that these commitments are acted upon.
Mark Fletcher.
I thank my right honourable friend for that answer. Given the horrible events that we are witnessing in Ukraine at the moment, does my right honourable friend agree that actually the move from COP towards more renewables is more important than ever, and in particular for our European neighbours, they need to weed themselves off Russian gas and oil for the good of our world?
Mr. Speaker, I think there is a lot of consensus in this House that the UK's significant expansion of renewables over the past decade, particularly the offshore wind sector, has reduced our dependence on gas. And my honourable friend is right that we need to continue to push out on this to ensure our domestic energy security. As I said, more on renewables, more on nuclear, more on hydrogen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now more than ever, we've got to make sure we've got security of supply. So following COP26, would my right honourable friend agree that investing in technologies like new nuclear, which is so important for constituencies like mine and the wider Lancashire area, is very important?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. When I was Business Secretary, we set out our 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, and in that we made very clear that we were going to be supporting nuclear. We followed that through, and I know that he will particularly have welcomed the funding that is going towards new SMR technology.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently met with the brilliant people at Rolls-Royce who are working on small modular reactors, and that will help fill the gap between fossil fuel and renewable energy. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that more investment into nuclear power will help combat global climate change, but more importantly, help our desperate constituents who are having to choose between eating or heating right now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, I very much share his view. Nuclear has to be part of our clean energy mix. We are investing, as he has acknowledged, in SMR technology through Rolls-Royce, and it also provides an export opportunity for the UK and the creation of jobs in our industrial heartlands.
Xander Stafford.
Speaker, my right honourable friend set out what steps he has taken to ensure the Glasgow Climate Pact starts delivering this year, 2022.
Well, Mr. Speaker, delivery of the Glasgow Climate Pact is very much the focus for this year. As I said, in Glasgow, we did manage to keep 1.5 alive, but its pulse is weak. And this will only strengthen if governments honour their commitments. Since COP, I've engaged with ministers from over 30 countries, and I will continue to engage and press them to honour their commitments.
Aaron Smith.
The credibility of the presidency depends on action at home. Next month, the Advanced Skills Construction Centre in my constituency will host my apprenticeship fair. does he agree that the jobs of the future and apprenticeships offer a credible way to take action at home? Will he support my fare, and will he answer how his government are supporting the jobs of the future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, apprenticeships, of course, are a big focus for this government. We have created many hundreds of thousands over the past years. And yes, ensuring apprenticeships in green technologies is absolutely vital, and I wish her well with her fare.
Very Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, would you and the Minister agree that if we're taking COP26 seriously, it's about what we do locally as well as what we do nationally? Is he aware that the House of Commons Commission and the contract for the Holocaust Memorial Building, which I fully support, has actually gone to a company, rather than putting all the materials and the waste and all that traffic on the river, which is easily done? They're going to put it on the contract they've chosen is going to all be on the road to snarl up London traffic and to pollute the air. Could he look at that? Could we look at this question locally and nationally right now?
Mr. Speaker, I know the point he's made. He'll appreciate it's not part of my responsibilities, but I'm sure Mr. Speaker and other relevant colleagues will have heard his call for action on this issue.
Shadow Minister Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week's IPCC report put forward their bleakest warning yet, stating that progress on adaptation is uneven, with increasing gaps between action taken and what is needed to deal with the increasing risks. It emphasises the urgency of immediate action, concluding that half measures are no longer an option. In light of this, will the COP President outline what concrete steps have been taken since COP26 to scale up finance for adaptation, whether he will increase ambition in light of the report, and if he will commit to bring a plan to this House on how we will meet the 2025 target?
Mr. Speaker, she raises a very important point, and of course this report was a stark warning, yet again another code red, that we need to take action. I did set out in answer to earlier questions what we are doing in terms of pushing forward, particularly on finance, doubling adaptation finance, and we will ensure that by the time we get to COP27, that trajectory has moved forward.
Top Biddles, Felicity Backham.
Number one, please.
President.
Mr. Speaker, Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine is at the forefront of all our minds, as are the brave and courageous people of Ukraine, who are having to defend themselves from the despicable onslaught of Putin's forces. And supporting and standing with Ukraine is rightly our most immediate priority. But as the IPCC report earlier this week highlighted, the chronic threat of climate change has not gone away. And that is why we need to redouble our efforts in ensuring that countries deliver on their commitments set out in the Glasgow Climate Pact.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the path to net zero not only creates clean, green energy, but also makes us energy resilient, which will further reduce our need for imported oil and gas?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend she's entirely right, and I can tell her that when I speak to governments around the world, they have seen the UK as a leader in a clean energy transition, in my recent visit, for instance, to Vietnam, they were particularly keen to understand the revenue mechanisms we put in place to ensure more private sector investment in our offshore wind sector.
Patrick Reddy.
Speaker, what steps is he taking to ensure that the voices of environmental and human rights defenders are heard in the COP process and that their safety and security is protected worldwide?
Mr. Speaker, at COP26 we ensured, indeed lead up to COP26, we ensured that the voices of civil society and youth were heard, and I'm sure this is something that all future COPs will want to ensure as well.
Blackadina.
The energy security of Europe is clearly going to be central to the security of us all. I commend the President for his tireless work to promote the growth of renewable energies across Europe. Could you update the House with his plans to press ahead with the nuclear agenda, in particular with our allies in Europe as well?
Well, Mr. Speaker, thankfully the UK is not reliant on Russian oil and gas, and that's because we've invested significantly in renewables and we will continue to do so. But she makes an important point. Every country needs to think about a managed clean energy transition and security of supply.
Richard Holden.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The next generation of jobs and apprenticeships are going to be delivered in the industries that the President talks about. Would he praise those employers reaching out to young people at my apprenticeships fair just a few weeks ago in concert about all the work that they're doing to deliver great jobs in these high-tech sectors for the next generation?
Mr. Speaker, employers in the private sector are going to be absolutely vital to the transition to net zero, and of course I commend all the employers who attended his apprenticeship fair, and indeed employers across the country for everything they're doing to ensure a clean transition by 2050 in our country.
Lib Dem.
Many countries will be considering how they can reduce their dependence on Russia for energy supplies. Will my right honourable friend use his presidency to help other countries ensure that they can diversify their supplies and use renewable energy with British assistance?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a really important point. In fact, we are working with developed country partners to see how we can support other nations make that transition to clean energy and reduce their dependence on fossil fuels.
Mr. Speaker, does the President recognise that consideration for biodiversity loss needs to be given parity in the government's plans for environmental protection alongside its existing plans for delivering net zero?
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Lady will know, we had a big focus on nature at COP26. We had a commitment from over 140 countries representing over 90% of forests around the world to ensure that they are protected, and we will of course continue to work on this issue with partners around the world.
Before we come to PMQs,